No Country for Old Men is one of the most gripping, intense movies of all time. But the movie doesn't just work spectacularly on a surface level, it perfectly encapsulates the struggle of modern life itself. But to understand the genius of No Country for Old Men, we need to dive straight into the story. Now, the movie begins with a sunrise shot of the Texas plain, and an opening monologue from one of our three main characters, Sheriff Ed Tom Bell. He tells the story of how times have changed as a lawman. Bell, along with his father and grandfather, were all sheriffs who worked in the Texas county, and Bell's speech reminisces of the sheriffs of the old days, who never carried a gun, and how he can't help but compare himself to these old timers. Bell just doesn't know what to make of the shifting times, and he finishes his story with a striking quote.
The crime you see now, it's hard to even take its measure. It's not that I'm afraid of it, but I don't want to push my chips forward and go out and meet something I don't understand.
And as after this scene, they're about to get a taste of what Bell means. As the monologue is wrapping up, we see a shot of young sheriff arresting a man and placing a strange device in the passenger seat of the car, a bolt pistol hooked up to a gas canister, the same kind that's used to slaughter livestock. The man being arrested is our second main character, Anton Chigurh, and as the young sheriff calls in the arrest at the office, Chigurh suddenly creeps up behind him, and just as he puts the phone down, Anton makes his move and brutally strangles the man to death, leaving countless boot markings on the floor in the process. And after the deed is done, Chigurh calmly washes his hands and exits the station, taking a police car while he's at it. After which Chigurh flags down a random car and nonchalantly asks the man to step outside. Thinking that Chigurh is an actual police officer, he complies right up until he gets a bolt gun to the head, killing him instantly. This death and the earlier death of the sheriff are just perfect examples of how the Coen brothers portray the world of their movies. In short, it's all down to chance. Both of Anton's victims were in the exact wrong place at exactly the wrong time. One moment they're alive, the next they're gone. This is the chaotic and completely ambivalent world that No Country for Old Men is set in, but it's also the same rules that we live in the modern world. In fact, it's not just the modern world. Humanity has been trying to come to terms with this for thousands of years. Buddhism, for example, uses this as its foundation. It teaches us that the world is made up of desire and suffering, and trying to control the world around you is like trying to build a house of cards. Eventually a gust of wind will knock it over. Only by not playing the game in the first place can you rise above it. However, Christianity is a different solution. Suffering is justified as the burden we all have to carry. Your reward lies in the next life, an eternity of bliss in God's kingdom. But it was Nietzsche specifically who predicted the shattering of this illusion. He prophesied that our scientific achievement and progression of society would kill God, or in this case the collective fantasy of universal justice. And so all we're left with is blind chance of the universe. But we shouldn't go the other way and assume the universe is inherently cruel. Instead, it's completely indifferent. Anton Chigurh is the embodiment of this cold, unfeeling nature. As to the universe, there's no difference between people and livestock. And so it's after this extremely fitting introduction to the brutality of Chigurh that we're introduced to our third and final main character, Llewelyn Moss. Moss is way out in the Texas desert hunting, and after firing his shot at one of the bucks, he follows the blood trail left behind, but then he notices something strange, a lone dog limping out in the field. So Moss begins wandering along with the dog, and eventually stumbles upon a number of abandoned cars in the middle of nowhere, where he sees a drug deal gone sour. Among the dead bodies and vehicles ridden with bullet holes, Moss finds a lone survivor, whose sole request is for water. However, Moss doesn't have any on hand, much to the disappointment of the man. After scouring the place for money, Moss determines that the last man standing from the gunfight must have stopped in the shade, and his prediction ends up being correct, and he finds a man slumped against a tree. But instead of running headfirst, Moss waits. Being a skilled hunter, he understands how people and animals think, and so once he's sure that the man is dead, he then approaches his corpse. He then finds $2 million in cash in a bag. But Moss's reaction to the money isn't really what you'd expect. Instead of being excited, he seems resigned. He instinctively knows the consequences of taking the money, and he knows it's not going to end well, and yet he takes it anyway. And as if to foreshadow what's coming, we then see a storm rumbling in the distance as Moss walks back with the money. But this scene doesn't only begin the plot of the movie, it also gives us our first insight to what this character represents. He's tough, handsome, charismatic, and stoic. He's the quintessential hero. But by taking this money, it shows that he really isn't above greed or self-interest. He's still resigned to chasing the hollow spectre of material wealth, even if it means he could lose everything. And he's aware of this. In this way, Moss represents one response to the brutality of nature. If the only things that really exist are pleasure and pain, your actions should only be motivated by gaining more pleasure and avoiding pain. And Moss has made a decision weighing the potential reward of the money above the pain of getting away with it. And it's a risky gamble, however the reward is huge. A lifetime of pleasure, of never having to work, of living the life he dreamed of. Anton would choose to pursue the money, but you get the sense it's just a means to an end, as it's left really vague in the story who he's actually working for. Instead, Anton is painted as a symbol of death, an allegory of life and death, of nature. So throughout the movie, Anton will be guided by his own strict rules because he sees himself as the law of nature. It's his only form of meaning in a modern world without any real ethics, moral virtue, or meaning. He is quoted the one right tool for the job as he refers to himself later on. If anything, this whole money thing is just a bonus, after the thrill of deciding nature. But by following this system of putting money over everything, inevitably leads to an unfulfilling life. And with the death of God and the idea of universal justice, our modern society has regressed back to the rule of nature. And this has undoubtedly changed society to encourage self-centered, hedonistic, money-focused behavior more than any other time in living memory. And you can just so clearly see it today in influencer culture. Tempted by quick money and fame, young men and women dedicate their lives entirely to an image. And most fail, and are then pushed to an uncaring industry obsessed with wealth. But even those who do succeed are left with millions of Instagram followers and a large bank account, and yet they really have no real friends or connections. They often have no family, and it's a toxic lifestyle for everyone involved. But this isn't just influencer culture. We see this with everything. Our whole economic system, our whole way of life is predicated around this concept that money is more important than family, community, and relationships. And Alexis de Tocqueville predicted this exact progression of society. See, even back in the 19th century, he saw that Western society was destined to become more and more materialistic. The tantalizing promise of the American dream, however far-fetched it really is, breeds a love of money above all else. And in reality, it should just be a means to an end. Instead, your focus should be on things that actually add meaning to your life. Beauty, culture, personality, and passions. However, Moss, following the American dream, goes on to ignore this completely. After returning home to his wife Carla Jean, Moss feels guilty over abandoning the man in the desert. So he makes the decision to load up with a gallon of water and return to the drug site. But once Moss arrives at the drug site, things quickly take a turn for the worse, as Moss finds the man dead, and almost immediately after, he starts getting chased by a truck who's firing shots at him. Narrowly escaping, he manages to flee to a nearby river, and finishes off a pursuing dog right before it can start tearing into him. Which is just another example of the lack of justice in this world. Moss is seemingly punished for his act of kindness rather than rewarded. Once Moss starts tending to his wounds, we transition to probably the most infamous scene in the movie, as we see Chigurh buying fuel for his stolen vehicle. After asking the price for the gas, Chigurh takes notice when the store owner reveals he knows where Anton is from, just by looking at his car. So Chigurh immediately sees this as a threat, and begins psychologically toying with him, and then proceeds to ask the question,
"What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?"
as he proceeds to flip a coin. The cashier doesn't know how to respond, and so he tells Chigurh he needs to know where he stands to win. Chigurh responds that the man stands to win everything and he needs to cool it. As the scene becomes tense and silent, the cashier finally calls heads, which ends up being the correct choice. Chigurh then congratulates the man and tells him to keep the coin as his lucky quarter, leaving with a knowing look that things could have turned out very differently if the cashier called it wrong. And it's in this scene that we see Anton Chigurh as the literal embodiment of death, resembling the brutal blind luck of nature. Because Chigurh's whole purpose in life is seemingly to carry out the law of nature, and everyone's playing this game of nature whether they like it or not. That's why for most of the movie, Anton seems as ruthless and unstoppable as death itself. But in his mind, he's powerless to follow nature's code. You can tell this as he's almost relieved when the store owner calls the coin correctly. It absolves Anton of his messed up moral duty to kill him. And it's in this way that Anton represents another answer to the brutal nature of the modern world. You see, in a world without morals, there's no real pragmatic reason to follow them anymore, as capitalism has destroyed family, community, and church, and so there's no pragmatic reason to follow any moral code anymore. And so without this moral code, Anton is unshackled. He can take whatever he wants, because the world reflects his lack of ethics, and it doesn't punish his behavior either. And it's the same psychopathic behavior that is now rewarded in our society, where the highest echelons of society are often occupied by the most cold and ruthless of us all, which is why it's no surprise that CEOs are at least 3 times more likely to be psychopaths. It's why we see the top influencers like Logan Paul use crypto scams to exploit their audience, as when the only value we're defined by is money, then people like Anton thrive. The only real difference between Anton and a ruthless CEO is that Anton hurts people directly instead of indirectly, and he's not putting on a fake facade to hide his cold veneer. After the coin scene, the focus then shifts back to Moss, who has arrived safely back at his home despite his wounds. Moss then sends his wife to her mother's and manages to escape to a motel where he hides the briefcase full of money inside an air vent. But now he's being hunted. Anton, after meeting up with some criminal associates, is driven to the scene of the drug deal gone wrong. He walks politely with them past the bodies as they explain what they know about what happened, and then they reveal that the briefcase of money had a tracker in it, and once they give Anton the receiver, they've served their purpose, and so he calmly executes them both. Moss then leaves the motel afterwards, but not before closing the curtain drapes behind him. Paranoid and on the edge, he gets some supplies and hires another taxi to take him back to his motel. However, as he rolls by his room, the curtain drapes are open. Someone has been inside, but he still needs to get the money back, so he orders another room besides his previous one. And as all of this is going on, Chigurh is hot on his tail, in the process of locating Moss using a tracking device installed in the briefcase. After Chigurh rents out a room for himself, he studies the interior, and makes his way into the room that he suspects is holding the money. And by using his cattle gun to blow open the lock, Chigurh then finds a group of Mexicans who had been waiting for Moss to show up. In a matter of seconds, Chigurh wipes all of them out, using a silenced shotgun, but he still doesn't manage to find the money, as Moss ingeniously pulled it through the vents from the other room and got away. Moss then makes his way to another hotel located elsewhere, where he orders himself a room for one night, but not before asking the clerk to call him if anyone else checks in. After trying to get some sleep, Moss finds it difficult as he starts to think about how he's being tracked so effectively, so he begins scouring the briefcase looking for a tracker, and after doing some digging, he finally manages to locate and remove the device. But unfortunately for Moss, this was a little too late, as Chigurh arrives just outside the door of his hotel room. And what happens next is a brutal game of cat and mouse. As Moss manages to get the drop on Anton first, he's quickly chased onto the streets, and after a violent shootout, both men are severely wounded. However, Moss somehow gets the upper hand, but just as he's about to move in for the kill, Chigurh manages to slip away. However, having been shot through the stomach, Moss then makes his way across the Mexican border, but not before throwing the briefcase into a nearby ditch. He's in a sorry state as he struggles to put distance between himself and Anton, but when he asks some strangers for help, they exploit him, making him pay $500 for a single shirt, being yet another example of how brutal human nature really is. Afterwards, Moss wakes up to a mariachi band singing a song directly in front of him, and he convinces them to take him to a hospital using a bloodied $100 bill. And it's here that we transition to Chigurh, who is also gravely wounded, but considering he's a wanted man, he just can't go to the hospital. So instead he robs a pharmacy, then uses the medical supplies to perform surgery on himself. And being the judge of nature himself, Anton's stoic character reacts very little to the pain. It's just part of the process, despite having been shot just hours ago. But back at the police station, we see Sheriff Bell conducting an investigation into the drug deal gone bad. Now, we haven't really mentioned him much so far, but he's always been one step behind the action at every turn, despite some very near misses. But this isn't just because of circumstance. Bell is clearly afraid of confronting Anton or the whole situation entirely. Earlier, he refused to work with a DEA agent following the case, and he does it again in this scene, as later when he investigates Moss's home, he lets the deputy go in first. He never even draws his gun, he just remains on the sidelines. And this source of fear comes from his beliefs about the world. You see, he always talks about the old days and how peaceful things were, with the opening monologue just being one example. Unable to deal with the brutality of living in the present, Bell always retreats into a blanket of the past and nostalgia. And this reaction is really common today. Nostalgia and everything surrounding it has skyrocketed in popularity recently, especially online and with Generation Z. And it's all because as people have left the shelter of childhood and woken up, they've realized just how harsh the modern world truly is. It wasn't like that for their great-grandparents, and it didn't seem like that way as a child, so you always imagine the past in these rosy glasses. Especially as today we're always bombarded on social media with information and stories about how messed up the world truly is. And that's why living in the past is a comfortable delusion, and it means that Bell doesn't have to confront reality. But nostalgia isn't the only delusion out there. Ideology is nostalgia turned forward, and it's comforting and addictive in all the same ways. Having a singular way of seeing the world makes everything simple and easy. Everything's painted black and white, and it gives you something to cling on to, but it also means that you never see the full picture or deal with real reality properly. And that's why you can't progress in life, because you can't tackle the necessary fears that are chaining you back to the past. And so Bell can't deal with what he's meant to confront, because it doesn't match how he thinks the world should be. In the same way, people who follow ideologies always use it to define their place in the world. It gives them an identity, a purpose, and a reason, but it always takes away your individuality and your personal growth. As when your actions and thoughts are always decided by a larger system, you're never really responsible for them in your head, and breaking out of this and creating your own rules and moral code is incredibly difficult. There's a reason Nietzsche thought that you needed to be a superhuman to achieve this, but you do need to do it to live authentically and not just be another pawn in the system. But getting back to the movie, Moss is then awoken in hospital by a bounty hunter named Carson Wells. Carson tries to convince Moss to go to the authorities with him, but Moss refuses. He's dead set on following the tragic path in front of him, his eyes only thinking about the money and the riches. So Carson leaves, but not before telling Moss to call him if he changes his mind. Then afterwards we see Sheriff Bell at a diner, who has arranged a meeting with Carla Jean. Sheriff Bell is looking for Moss to ensure his safety, but unfortunately for him, Carla Jean has no idea where he is. Bel's still one step behind. And that's when we see Carson Wells looking for the money on the outskirts of the border. He manages to find it and begins returning to his hotel room, until he's met by Chigurh, who's walking directly behind him, wielding his silenced shotgun. Chigurh then escorts Wells to his room, where the two sit down and have a talk. Now during the meeting, Wells tries bargaining for his life, but they both know Chigurh just won't make a deal. He's nature, and nature can't be bargained with. So then Chigurh asks Wells the question,
If the rule you followed brought you to this, of what use was the rule?
And this is another hint towards Chigurh's disdain for artificial moral codes. In a godless world, they only limit you. So Wells declines to answer, and insists that Chigurh is crazy. And that's when the phone begins ringing, and Chigurh shoots Wells where he sits. And it turned out on that phone was Moss, and they both understand that Chigurh is planning to kill his wife. Chigurh then demands the money in exchange for her life, but Moss declines and hangs up the phone. So Moss then retrieves the briefcase and arranges to meet Carla Jean at a motel in El Paso, where he intends to hide her and keep her safe. But unfortunately for Moss, he will never actually see her again. His desire for money has destroyed his family, as when they're on their way to the motel, cartel members intercept Carla Jean and their elderly mother and get her to unwittingly tell them where to find Moss. And later on we see the aftermath of this. As Bell is driving along the road, he hears gunshots and sees a car and some men pulling away. These men have just killed Moss, but they didn't find the money and left. And whilst this might seem underwhelming at first, it's actually meant to be this way. Now usually stories build up to a big confrontation between the hero and the villain, and sure it seemed like that was being set up, but in real life things don't usually work that way, and Moss died unceremoniously. Even if it wasn't Anton himself that caught up to Moss, death itself did in the end anyway. But in truth, although Moss fits the hero archetype, he wasn't really the main character of the story. Instead that's Bell, the sheriff trying to catch up to the world, as the movie begins with him and it ends with him. The whole gripping story of Moss and Chigurh, and all the focus on money was just a backdrop for this. It was one chapter of a never-ending story. It's Bell who's transcending the story and actually develops as a character, as we're about to see. You see, when Bell arrives on the scene, he discovers Moss's corpse, along with no sign of the money. After being tantalizing close to the case, Bell has just missed his final chance to make things right, and it hits him hard. And when he returns to the crime scene the next day, it's implied that Anton is waiting for him. But when Bell opens the door, there's no one there. He also finds an air duct with scratches all over it. We can deduce that Moss hid the money the same way, as the cartel who killed him couldn't find it, but Anton did and left just in time. Despite all his work, Bell lost and Anton made off with the money. And after learning this, he plans to quit the force, rationalizing it through his view of a world that's passed him by. But later Bell visits his Uncle Ellis, who's an ex-lawman. Bell is planning on retiring from police work, as he feels overmatched by the senseless violence going on. But instead of affirming his beliefs, Ellis is about to unwrap the entire meaning of the film, where he tells Bell that his feeling is nothing new, and sheriffs have always felt out of their time. Ellis then tells the story of a lawman who was killed on his own porch in the middle of the day, and reiterates that violence has always been prevalent in the region, stating that Bell just can't stop what's coming. And this is really the first honest conversation Bell has had about this. Before, when he's mentioned feeling like time has passed him by, people always agree with him. An old Texas sheriff he meets in a previous scene just echoes his feelings. Everyone around him just longs for the past. They feel the same as everyone. But the world is unchanged. It's still just as violent as it's always been. And it's this scene that pulls Bell out of his delusions of the good old days and into reality, although it's already too late for Moss. A few weeks later, we transition to the recently widowed Carla Jean, who finds Chigurh waiting for her in the bedroom. She tries to refuse the coin toss, but Chigurh has had it all before, and mentions how people always say the same thing. The next shot then shows Chigurh exiting the house, checking the cleanliness of his boots in the process. And it's the same thing he always does after killing people like Carson, so it implies that he killed Carla Jean as well. Then afterwards, Chigurh is driving through an intersection, but then suddenly out of nowhere, he finds himself in a nasty car accident when he gets T-boned by someone running a red light. Now for nearly the whole movie, Chigurh has been an unstoppable force, the personification of death and nature. But despite how inhuman and supernatural he seems, Anton is still subject to the same blind chance that everyone else is. Even though he sees himself as the universe's tool, he's still vulnerable to it. And this is proved when two kids arrive on the scene and check on the well-being of Chigurh. They even give him one of the shirts for free. But before, Moss had to buy a shirt from the strangers he met. Regardless, Chigurh gives the kids $100 so they'll say they didn't see him. Chigurh then limps away from the crash, avoiding justice completely. It would have been perfect dramatic irony if Chigurh was killed by blind chance after everything he did, but it's just not the case. Instead, we see that the universe isn't punishing or rewarding Chigurh for his actions, it's just indifferent blind chance. And this brings us to the final scene, when Bell describes two dreams he had. The first dream describes meeting his father in town after he lost money. The second dream tells the tale of him and his father carrying a torch on horseback in the older times. It was snowing on a mountain pass, and his father rode past him holding his head down. Bell then describes how he knew his father was going on ahead, fixing to make a fire in the cold dark. and Bell knew his father would be waiting for him there. The camera then focuses on Bell as he states the final line,
Then I woke up.
and this is the whole moral of the story. It puts into focus how all of the events add up. We saw the other responses to the godlessness of the universe. Moss tried to beat it to no avail. Anton Chigurh embraced it, giving up everything human to become an unstoppable instrument of chance. And Bell denied it completely, instead staying in the morning of the good old days. But as the title says, there is no country for old men, and there never has been. Instead, it's in its final scenes the movie hints at how to rise above the chaos. The world that Bell's father lived in was just as brutal as it is in the movie or in reality, but he carried the torch and did his work to make sure that there was a shining light in the darkness. If there's no justice in the universe, then the only way to see justice happen is by creating it yourself. And throughout the movie, Bell refused to accept this and missed his chance to change the story at every opportunity. He needed to reject the past for a better future. Instead, he should have carried the light that his father carried before him. And the same thing is true today for all of you watching. It may be true that the world is random and brutal, but that doesn't mean you should give up. It might be even harder today, but a good world can only exist if there's people willing to work for it. And for a high quality future, we must reject our low quality present. Otherwise, the world devolves to the point where people like Anton Chigurh will thrive whilst everyone else suffers, when big CEOs, narcissistic psychopathic influencers, and the worst of mankind defines its future. It may be true that our world is far closer to that reality than justice, but it will only get better through people making the choice to move forward and carry their torch.